I'll start. Hey, Liam, any opening remarks before we start?
Yeah, sure. First off, I recognize that India right now is in a really difficult spot, and I've been following the news, and I think that this conversation is so appropriate for right now because I'm sure that most everyone right now is probably working from home all throughout Asia because of the pandemic, and it's something that we have team members throughout that entire area. So it's definitely been something that we've been paying attention to, and I feel so sad for everyone that's down there, and I hope that you guys get over it as quickly as humanly possible.
No, definitely. Thanks a lot for that, Liam. And to the audience, we have the chat option. Of course, you can pick in. You can put in the questions. I'll take the questions slightly later in the session. Or yes, feel free to chime in anything that you want to ask, or if you have any comments, put it in the chat. Yeah. Okay, great. We'll get started. So,
Sure.
Basic question, Liam, to start with.
Yep.
Do you have a sense of how many people are working remotely right now in the world?
So this was actually a pretty interesting one. I have a couple slides that connect to this, which I think is actually probably going to be a really interesting perspective to be able to take a look at. Let me just see if I can share my screen here for a second.
Okay.
So hopefully everyone can see my screen. So here's a very interesting problem. It really kind of floats into what the heck happened in March. And can you see my screen okay, Gaurav? Yes, no?
Yes.
Oh yeah, okay, you can see my screen, great. So what happened in March? Well, this happened in March. This is actually another friend of ours that was looking at the actual work from home data that was occurring during that time. And you can see this crazy ass spike up, which was the amount of activity that was happening at home. This is also another really great database that you can take a look at. Google has done a fantastic job of analyzing what the heck is happening when it comes to the pandemic. And they're doing it through anonymously tracking all of the Android devices globally. So they can collect retail and recreation data, which you can see has had a bit of a recurve over the last couple of months, parks. And this is the thing that's very interesting. In the United States, this is workplace activity. And what we've discovered is that workplace activity has had the lowest level of rebound of any of these other categories of activity inside of society. So this is a really kind of interesting perspective now. Effectively, 40 to 45% of the US workforce is currently working remotely, and this has been consistent since March of 2020, and we have not seen that number change at all since the start of the pandemic. Literally, after the first 3 months of the pandemic, it's stabilized and it's floated around the 40 to 45% mark in the United States, and this has a lot of applications globally as well. So it's a really interesting time for remote work because a lot of people have now recognized that the genie is out of the bottle, right? So the ability for people to be able to work remotely has been a complete game changer for the vast majority of society. And the biggest push against that has been fundamentally from employers that have said, hey, you know what, this remote work thing, it doesn't really work. Well, this has been a fantastic thing. If there is a silver lining inside of the pandemic, it is allowing everyone to be able to test that assumption. And they found en masse that assumption is incorrect. People are not only as productive as they were in the office, but in a lot of cases, they're actually more productive than when they were in the office.
No, I can't agree more with it, really, based on my own experience and what happened at my teams and even other startups. So definitely, I agree with that. So that's been the status quo. What has happened till now? What do you think it's going to happen in the next 12 months, where is the remote work going to be?
So we polled, and we lovingly call them the pandemic panickers, the people that ended up in March going, oh my God, we got to take all of our team and we've got to get them remote. And out of that group, we've identified 50% of that community states that they're going to remain remote. 40% believe that they're going to go to a hybrid work model, and 10% are going to go back to the office. Now, the definition of hybrid is a really important one that I think a lot of people have to take into consideration. Hybrid work relationships are not all created equal. Effectively, office, we understand that. Remote, we understand that. But hybrid could be you work 1 day in the office and you work 4 days remote, or it could be you work 4 days in the office and you work 1 day remote. So we don't really know that mix, but fundamentally at this point, 50% of the people that went remote during the pandemic are not going back by our data. And that's the worst case scenario that we're seeing.
Cool. And that's a major shift in the world already. You can see, like I think nobody predicted, of course, that I think even with the pandemic, when it hit, nobody had predicted that that remote work will really take over this big way, and it will continue. I think in March 2020, when it started, people were still saying that, then there were announcements that we'll start the offices in September, October, and then it just kept pushing through. I think.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. So there's a lot of people that believe, at least in the United States, that everyone's going to go back to the office in the fall. And by our data, we just don't necessarily see that. And it's fundamentally a push and pull issue. So we have the employers that have now recognized, I can now reduce the second most expensive line item in my P&L, which is my office space. And I can reduce that by 50, 60%, even if I'm going to a hybrid model. And then from the bottom up, we have the employees that have stated, I am not going to stop working remotely. I am going to continue to work remotely. And if you are not, as an employer, going to allow me to work remotely, I'm going to find another job that can allow me to work remotely, because now that genie has been let out of the bottle and a whole bunch of people can get access to those types of job opportunities. So it's going to be a very interesting time in the fall in the United States to really test out whether or not this premise is correct. By that time, probably 75%, 80% of the population will have had their vaccinations. So that'll really be the first test to see whether or not remote is going to be a long-term trend or this is just going to be a blip.
And how do you think this is going to impact the workforce in the longer term, this remote work?
So, I mean, and we're speaking to an Asian audience fundamentally. I think that countries like India, Indonesia, the Philippines, all of that area is going to see a massive resurgence and some people have called it white collar outsourcing, but I actually don't really like that terminology. I think that we're just going to be able to recognize that people can work remotely, and they don't just have to work remotely in another city in the United States or another state in the United States. They can work remotely anywhere on planet Earth. So you're going to see a huge proliferation of international talent that is, number one, going to be able to stay where they live. Little known fact, 53% of companies in San Francisco with more than 1,000 employees are first-generation immigrants. San Francisco has been a fantastic way of centralizing the best development talent, the best tech talent on the planet and focusing it on one place. And the vast majority of that talent isn't in the United States, it's global, right? So now that's going to completely change as a lot of these companies, even Facebook, said 50% of their workforce is going to be working remotely in the next 5 years. And their plan is to hire internationally and just keep that talent exactly where they are. So huge gains for the developing markets. Probably not a huge win for the United States, but in the grand scheme of things, I think we're going to have a much more equal world. I have a philosophy that remote work really empowers employers and employees to find the best of each other. And that's exactly what's going to happen, in my opinion, over the next 12 months.
Great. And I have a take on this. Well, what I believe is this is a moment where we realize that if we go remote work is not just about the economics of it, but or even just the safety. I'll say it's beyond that, because this way we can see the world becoming a more sustainable place. Yeah, because we'll be cutting down on the useless business travel, and at the same time, we'll be decongesting these mega cities, and that's going to help. And as you rightly pointed out, as an individual, probably you won't need to move all the way to San Francisco, or you can really work wherever you are. And I think that's going to be a huge win, because the sense of fulfillment when you are at a place where you grew up, you're with your family, your friends. I think that's simply irreplaceable.
One perfect example is Coinbase. Coinbase is a cryptocurrency wallet that just went public about 2 weeks ago, and they went public at a $141 billion US market cap. They entered number 89 on the S&P 500 in the United States. And for the first time in the history of the SEC, they have been allowed to state that their headquarters is nowhere. They are a remote first company, and that is the largest IPO in the last 2 years inside of the United States, and actually globally. So I see this being a huge tide change. And when they were asked about why they chose nowhere as a location, they stated that anything else would be a lie, which is why the SEC allowed them to actually state that their headquarters is located nowhere. I remember 10 years ago when we first started Time Doctor, we had to actually set up an office in Las Vegas, Nevada. It still exists. It's a very small little office. I've been in it once. We put one employee in there whenever they want. And we had to do that to actually gain legitimacy. Even Stripe, our payment processor in Braintree, would not do business with us because we didn't have a physical location. Now, that seems insane now, but 10 years ago, we just couldn't do business that way. So that's how far we've come in a very short amount of time, where 10 years ago, remote was seen as a small cottage industry. It was a lifestyle business that you couldn't really, build a serious business with. 10 years later, the largest tech IPO of the last 2 years, $141 billion tech IPO, is a remote first company. So I'm very excited about the next couple of years.
Oh, great. That's really, I think, the best example right now, which we can use to counter everything that's coming against the thesis of remote. Yeah, definitely. Staying in India, I can definitely relate to it. Still, we are required to have a physical address, because banks won't talk to you unless you have a physical address.
And that's another thing too. When we look at the future of remote work, it's going to apply to absolutely everything. And there is that old guard. Just as a perfect example, I just set up a brand new corporation, and I needed to get a US bank account under this US corporation. Me being a foreigner, I'm Canadian, it was taking 8 weeks for me to make the applications inside of the United States with banks to be able to work with them. But then, and free shout out for Mercury.com, Mercury.com is a fantastic platform where I was able to do my KYC identification, passport documentation in under 10 minutes. I literally just took photos on the app, and I had a bank account, and I was ready to do business with no physical location. This is really the future, when we recognize, and it's so important for countries outside of that Western framework to recognize that this is an equalizer now, that everyone will be able to approach the market equally. And I think the next couple of years, you're going to see the rise of tech companies that are just not going to be located in San Francisco or New York or London anymore. They're going to be existing outside of that ecosystem because of just the ability for remote work to empower people to build these massive companies without a physical location.
Great. I think that's what it told. So coming back to the SaaS theme, so looking at SaaS companies and looking at the culture and around SaaS, what's the best way to go about structuring a remote team in this context?
So first off, I think we have almost like a Model T moment where if you're a SaaS business right now, and I'm going to kind of put this down at SaaS Insiders, this is something you can hold to me years from now. I think the vast majority of SaaS businesses within the next 5 years will not be remote, but will not be able to actually not be remote, because it is so much of a better business model in order to actually bring your product to market, right? If you have your back end and front end and you've got Stripe set up, you're running through AWS, your entire technology stack is in the cloud. So that's one big thing. But then secondarily, just from a generalized structure, the big thing that a lot of SaaS companies and companies in general don't really recognize is the difference between synchronous and asynchronous forms of management. So if I had to boil down the core reason why remote companies fail or succeed, it boils down to synchronous versus asynchronous communication. And effectively, and I lost Gaurav there for a second. Oh, he's back. So asynchronous and synchronous is fundamentally right now what we're doing is we're communicating synchronously, right? If you have a question, you can ask me and I can respond to it live. However, asynchronous is the recording of this session. So someone 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 years from now can come back to this and can actually analyze this entire process. They can scrub through the video queue with us, and they can get so much more richness from that information when they want to consume it. And that's really the difference is on-premise companies, which is what we call businesses that work out of an office, they pay such a huge cost for synchronous communication. Literally everyone drives in to a certain location for an hour and a half every single day to be synchronous, to collaborate. But the big assumption, and this is something that a lot of people don't recognize, is collaboration and synchronous communication a lot of the times is wrong. Actually, not collaborating and communicating synchronously allows you to accomplish more deep work throughout your workday. And so remote first companies have recognized that by having an a la carte methodology to synchronous communication, as opposed to a buffet model, which is what offices do, you can actually be way more effective, and you can focus on, let's do 6 hours of deep work and let's do half an hour of actual synchronous work so that we can get back to that deep work as quickly as humanly possible. That's the big thing that a lot of people don't recognize. I mean, I could do a 3-hour presentation, to be honest with you, on that. That's what we talk about a lot at Running Remote, but that's the big thing that I'm just trying to hammer inside of everyone's head. Working from home and working remotely is not recreating the office in a remote setting. It is a different animal. It is a different way of working, and you have to bypass that in order to be successful at it.
No, thanks, Liam. That's a great example. I'm going to quote it on LinkedIn. A la carte versus buffet model. Really, really very interesting. Okay. And now that we have already seen, so in terms of SaaS world, of course, remote work is not entirely new. Pointed out, there have been companies already which were remote, and of course now everybody has been pushed to that. But based on just last 1 year, what do you see where the SaaS companies are going wrong in terms of remote work?
So outside of synchronous communication, the next big point is improper process documentation. Inside of remote first companies, we process document everything. So what does that effectively mean? It means anything that we do on a regular basis, we write it down, we digitize it, and then we can have that living document communicated to other team members. And a lot of the times this is really boring. A lot of people don't necessarily want to do this, but it is by far the fastest way to become a big SaaS company as quick as humanly possible. Large corporations, this is how they work, soup to nuts. It is a form of bureaucracy. And we try to make that bureaucracy as efficiently as humanly possible. But as an example, even setting up this call with SaaS Insider, there was a process document which was inside of Notion, which very clearly identified to me what link I needed to click on, what the instructions were for me to be able to come to this particular page, and all of the different features that I needed to understand to be able to do this presentation. We do that for everything. We have thousands of different process documents on absolutely everything inside of the business, even down to how we sign our signature in emails, so that orders, and this is a really great quote that I steal from Napoleon Bonaparte, and I change it around. He had orders, and I like to have instructions, which is instructions should not be easy to understand. They should be impossible to misunderstand. And that's the big click that everyone needs to recognize, is write all of these process documents quite literally like you are writing to a 5-year-old. Be very, very clear with everything that you're saying. And that way, anyone that comes off the street will understand how your business operates, which means you can scale your business as quickly as humanly possible. If you need to hire 100 salespeople, the process inside of your organization should be able to actually train those people on their own. You shouldn't necessarily have a managerial level that does it.
Great. Okay. It's just 5 minutes to the session. I'm just looking for if we have any questions from the audience. No, I don't see anything coming. Hey guys, if you have any questions, please put it on chat. I've been putting up the polls, good response on the polls, but yeah, it will be great if there's any question as well.
Yeah, well, we finish up on that. I mean, I think the other thing too is recognizing that this is just not going away. This is something that we really need to, the people that take this type of methodology, meaning a remote first methodology, and run with it, they're going to have such a huge strategic advantage in the marketplace, quite literally over the next 12 to 36 months, in comparison to people that don't do it. Yeah. I was talking to the guys at GitLab, which are a fantastic remote first asynchronous company. And they have the biggest process document that's open source on the face of the planet, about.gitlab.com/handbook. It's an 8,000 page document on everything inside of GitLab. And they really do see this as a Model T moment, which is when the first Model T rolled off the production line for Ford Motor Company, the vast majority of cars were not run through a production line. 5 years later, all cars were run through a production line. So it's one of those little clicks that people have to recognize, is we're at kind of a real point in history where we're going to move from the office environment to primarily the remote environment, at least when it comes to working on computers. And I mean, right now in the SaaS world, effectively 98% of jobs that are in SaaS can be remote. So I really see SaaS as a tip of the spear when it comes to remote work. And there are a lot of companies that are working remotely, but I think there's still a really far way for everyone to go.
Great. I see we still have 3 minutes. Maybe I have the temptation to have one more question that I wanted to ask. Liam, how do you handle the trust deficit in remote work? Well, that's been one topic which is it comes a lot, especially with founders. Most of them don't speak out openly, but it's there in the mind.
Yeah, I think that you have to, number one, there has to be a component of accountability. The number one question for remote founders and actually for any business owner is, okay, well, I used to have them in an office and I could see what they're doing. Now I don't know what they're doing. And I think you have to make sure that you keep that accountability in place. Having a time tracking tool like Time Doctor is a really good way to be able to keep that type of accountability. But more than that, it's about actually getting their work done. And it doesn't really matter when they get that work done. I'll give you a perfect example. I don't know if you know the concept of the 9 to 5 and where it came from. So the 9 to 5, this is something that just blew my mind when I learned it. It happened during the Industrial Revolution. There was not a 9 to 5 before. People just worked when they wanted to work. But then when you had a factory and there was no electrical lighting, the only way that you could work in the factory would be when the sun comes into the factory from 9 to 5. And that's why they didn't have people working at 6 and 7 p.m. because it wasn't safe and people couldn't actually get their work done. So this entire premise of working a certain amount of hours is really an incorrect premise. What we need to do is figure out how are people being productive inside of their work and how can we maximize that? And that's really the direction that we need to go. So have very clear KPIs, make sure that they're quantitative.